Welcome to the BOGART Effect, a wealthy wisdom podcast. The following BOGART Effect podcast is intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from BOGART or another investment professional. Please see important disclosure information at the end of the presentation.
All right. Good morning. Welcome to the BOGART Effect. I've got the pleasure of having Austin with me today, and we're going to be talking about what to bring to your first meeting with a financial advisor. Yeah, this is a topic that we get asked a lot, and candidly, as we're meeting a new household, we have a whole list of things that we like to provide. And Austin, I liked how you said it in our prep. There's the list of the what. But most importantly, what we want to emphasize today is why we need it and the value that we can provide as we're doing it. One of the things I say a lot, and I genuinely believe it, is a financial advisor's job is to help you solve your problems. A really good financial advisor puts themselves in a position to be able to anticipate what your problems are going to be. And a lot of that is based around this conversation today, right? Like getting the data in order to be able to build a plan to not only talk about where we are at present, but where we're anticipating to be in the future. So, Austin, thanks for joining and really looking forward to having a good conversation today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show.
So why don't we, kind of introduce the topic, what we're looking for, and then let's really just dive into the why.
Yeah, that sounds great. So a pretty common experience when you're meeting with your financial advisor for the first time or prospective advisor. Well, first off, congratulations for taking the time to meet with an advisor and really set your financial priorities in order. But a common experience is you have the meeting and then they send you a giant list of documents, and they say, come back with a giant binder full of stuff. Not necessarily binders anymore. And you want to know, why exactly do I need to go back and provide all of this information for you guys? It's a pretty common sentiment, I think.
Well, and candidly, it can be intimidating.
Absolutely.
The list of things. And it can take a long time to pull, especially if you've changed companies and you have legacy plans from previous employers and things of the sort, or have spouses. So, the first thing that I think is imperative to bring to the meeting is tax returns. And it's usually the last 2 or 3 years worth of tax returns. But talk to the audience a little bit about why we need those returns.
Yeah, absolutely. So tax returns are a gold mine as far as information goes. For one, the first thing that'll pop right off the page is the actual income numbers. A lot of times folks will have multiple income streams. You'll have rental income, you'll have bonuses through work, you'll have your salary, your wife's salary, and it's hard to keep track of the gross numbers of that. So that's just the first thing that I can see in the tax return. And that information is pretty relevant in a couple of ways. The first is that it shows the marginal tax bracket, and that's a big driver for one of the main changes, which is Roth contributions versus contributing to a traditional IRA. Getting that raw income number, I think, is very important for a lot of decisions, even down the road.
Well, and even I'm going to pull on that. A lot of wealth accumulation is around not only where you're saving, but how you're saving it, right? And for example, you just mentioned Roth, but one of the conversations might be, should we be saving in a Roth 401k? Or under the new Tax Reform Act, are you going to be obligated to save your catch-up contribution in a Roth 401k as an example? And are we prepared for that? Again, so many conversations that we can have off of this. And then one of the things that we love doing while we're in the accumulation phase is things like a backdoor Roth contribution. And we've got an entire podcast talking about what that is, but it's a way of saving money while you're in that accumulation mode in a Roth, so it's growing completely tax-free. And when you take the money out, it's completely tax-free, right? So it's another optimization strategy while we're in the accumulation mode. But what else, is on the tax returns that we find valuable, Austin?
Yeah, some other information that you can find on the tax return are capital loss carry forwards. For example, if you've realized losses, you could utilize those to offset capital gains, which that plays into a later strategy when we're looking into the investment. So this is a little bit of a sneak peek to a later topic.
Well, I call that the lemonade from the lemons, right? Like no one likes having losses, but when we realize losses, they carry forward in perpetuity until you have gains that you can use to offset them, which you're going to have gains, right? You got to have confidence. If you invest long enough, you're going to have gains. It's nice to have loss carry forwards to be able to offset those gains.
And another thing that we can get off the tax return is rental income, rental information. That a lot of times it kind of goes to the back of the mind. It's not something that you're actively thinking about. And also on the tax return, you can utilize income to prevent any surprises with Medicare and IRMA because your income from 2 years ago affects premiums. That's one of the reasons we look back for 2 years.
Yeah. So maybe just to explain that a little bit more detail, but for our retired households that are moving into Medicare ages, which starts at age 65, the cost of your Medicare Part B premiums is determined based upon your income from 2 years prior. And as Austin mentioned, that's called IRMA. It just requires a little bit of advanced planning. And it comes back to how I introduced this podcast, which is we're trying to anticipate future issues that you're going to be having. One of them is the cost of medical, which was directly impacted by our taxable income from 2 years prior once we attain the age of 63 or later, because your income for the year you turn 63 is going to be the first Medicare premium. And we do have podcasts on that one as well. So delighted to have you participate in those. The next thing that we always need to get our hands on is any type of investment account or even material checking account or emergency fund statements. Talk to me, Austin, a little bit about what are the types of account documents we need there, and then let's dive into why we need those types of documents.
Yeah, absolutely. So for investment statements, there's a couple of different categories. The first one being 401ks, and that's old or new. In fact, it's important to kind of track down and look for old or lost 401ks that you're not necessarily taking advantage of. Your average American actually changes jobs 9 to 12 times during their career. And a lot of times people don't necessarily roll their 401k with them. I know my wife personally has 2 outstanding 401ks and, we haven't been at it that long. So
we need to have a conversation about that
401k
after this.
Oh, yeah. Looking for 401ks, though, is important to make sure that you've got the right strategy for your age and your objectives, and your risk tolerance is important. And 401ks are actually pretty easily forgotten. It's good to check those out for expense ratios and allocation, because what you set when you were 20 years old can be a whole lot different for what you're setting at 45 years old or older. So that's the first one. Beyond that, there's also traditional IRAs outside of employer retirement plans, and Roth IRAs, as you have those as well. Last, coming up to brokerage accounts, which are after-tax accounts. Really, it's important to get all of these documents so we can evaluate your investments and your strategy to make sure that it's appropriate.
Well, and I would add to that cost efficiency, optimization, and when we're building out the plan, it's very helpful to see, for example, we talk about the brokerage accounts. We need to see what the capital gains information is, because the position might be worth, let's just say $100,000, but you might have bought it for $10,000. Well, not assuming or properly modeling in that $90,000 gain and what the tax implications are going to be on that is inaccurate from a planning perspective, right? Because you're not going to net out the 100. You're going to net out the 100 minus the capital gains on the $90,000 of appreciation. So that needs to be properly modeled. Or if we talk about what is sitting in the IRA accounts, pre-tax accounts, right? We need to start modeling what the implications are going to be of future required minimum distributions. And does that dictate doing some strategies while we're in potentially a lower income tax environment, as an example? So all of them have this kind of circular recurring need where we need as much data as we possibly can get there. Now, related to this is going to be anything that's employer benefit related, right? That would be, obviously we've already talked about retirement plans like 401ks, but this would be, do you have a pension? Is there a lump sum option on the pension? Do you have restricted stock? RSUs are kind of what they're known. Do you have any type of stock options, and what type of stock options are those, and what are the vesting schedules off of those? Like, all of those are things that come directly in. And then we want to have a conversation of, like, for example, within the 401k, do you have employer stock? Because if you have employer stock, we should be looking at things like net unrealized appreciation and building that into your financial plan and modeling. So talk to me a little bit more about the different types of employer plans, Austin, that you think we need to make sure that someone brings to their financial advisor at that first meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the employer benefits, the most important is pension options. I think it's very pertinent for our clients in particular to evaluate whether you want to take the pension or the lump sum. And if you're planning on retiring, if you have a couple different ideas, say 50, 55, 60, it's really important to run those pension estimates to help us help you make that decision. Getting that ahead of time really allows us to start helping earlier, I think.
What about employer life insurance and health savings plans, things of that sort?
Oh, absolutely. That comes right in second place, right behind the pension for me. A lot of folks, you'll have existing life insurance and disability insurance through work, and it's important to make sure you're not underinsured or you're not overinsured. For example, if you have 20 more years of working, you've got kids with college, you've got a mortgage that you'd like paid off in the event that something unfortunate happens to you, sometimes that employer life insurance isn't enough. Other times, you'll have folks that come in with pretty significant term life insurance, and then they're spending money on supplemental employer insurance, and you're carrying 3 or 4 million when maybe you've only got 5 more years of working. And so you're paying money for almost a useless benefit. So it's really important to evaluate what you're enrolled in, why, and what you do and don't have.
What I hear there, though, is the integration, and I know we're going to talk about insurance policies in a second, but the integration of things that you have from your employer, in addition to things that you're going to consider outside of your employer, right? What are some of the common mistakes that happen, though, along the way? Obviously, you already talked about like over-insuring. I got that one. But what are some of the others?
Yeah, another thing is if you have the option to utilize an HSA, not making the maximum HSA contribution. I personally think HSAs are incredible. You've got the deduction when you make the contribution, and when you take it out, if it's for a medical expense, it's completely tax-free as well. So an HSA is almost triple tax advantaged in a lot of ways, and people do not utilize it to the fullest extent.
Well, and maybe just to explain that real quick, an HSA is a health savings account, right? So they parallel and map very nicely, especially if you have an employer plan that's very high deductible, or extremely low, high deductible or low benefits relative to that deductible. This is a bucket of money, as Austin just said, is tax-free as long as it's coming out for medical expenses. I'd tell you, when you're younger and have young kids, those medical numbers can get pretty high. And we want to make sure that you're not leaving money on the table. By the way, I would parallel this with, as we're sitting down and reviewing any of your other retirement plans that are available to you, to ensure that we're not leaving money on the table. For example, I can't tell you the number of times I've seen households that are not maxing out the company match in a retirement plan, as an example. And that's one of the things where very quickly, when we're looking at the statement for these things, it's like, hey, you're leaving money on the table here. Let's make sure that we make this adjustment. Even if it means we save a little less in this category, we want to make sure that we're maxing out the free money, if you will, coming off of benefits that you're getting from employer plans. So, I'd like to transition and talk a little bit about insurance policies. And I know we talked a little bit about employer plans, and I want to talk a little and how we integrate some of the personal stuff. I think it gets there's a misconception around what insurance represents and what the need is, and I think ultimately a lot of the driver there comes from where you are in your life, and what I mean by this is when you're younger and you've got young families, and loss of income is I would say, very material, potentially catastrophic risk. You need a lot of life insurance. And as you already identified, Austin, as you're getting closer and closer and closer to retirement, well, I'm going to argue that the loss of income risk is declining, right? So materially, you should see insurance policies or the value of the amount of insurance that you're carrying should start to reduce as you get closer and closer to retirement. Because simultaneously, you're also accumulating assets, which give you the ability to live off of, right? So insurance is something that needs to be integrated in this planning process. Wherever you are in this journey of life and accumulation, I think that it's very appropriate to make sure that you're integrating insurance as part of your long-term plan. But I'll tell you from our experience, most of the people that I have visited with over my career are underinsured, and in different forms or fashion, or they totally rely solely on their employer plans, and they're not necessarily integrating that conversation with what is the risk associated with loss of income. So talk to me a little bit about insurance at a deeper level, because it's not just life insurance. There's disability insurance, there's long-term care insurance. How does all of that integrate into the planning process, Austin?
Yeah. So there's a lot, as you mentioned, there's a lot more beyond life insurance. That's the first thing people think of. But one of the most critical types of insurance and one of the least understood is disability. 1 in 3 Americans will suffer some sort of disability, whether long-term or short-term, before retirement. And again, you mentioned there's the risk and the loss of income. If you're disabled and you've losing your income, you still have, significant expenses. You're still a 2-person household. You still need to buy groceries for 2 people, but with the loss of income. So in some ways, you could argue that disability is almost as important or more so than life. Most folks will get disability through their employers, but there's cases if you're a very high earner, disability typically only goes up to 60%. And if you need that full 100%, I've almost never seen people be insured for disability outside of their work coverage, but I actually think it's very important to do.
Yep.
Beyond disability, there's also long-term care and umbrella policies. An umbrella policy is a relatively cheap, in the grand scheme of things, insurance policy that covers beyond your coverages. And in this day and age, it's actually pretty easy to go beyond your coverages. This umbrella covers home insurance, auto insurance, and I can just say, with some of the prices of cars these days, it's very easy if you get in an accident with someone Bentley to shoot up over your car insurance limits.
And I would also emphasize with umbrellas. Umbrellas are really specifically adding on for liability protection. But the thing that I found is you can also be sued now for income potential. So this is a conversation I like to have with, let's just say, some of our clients that have now adult children. But let's just say, for example, your adult child is going to be a lawyer. And they're graduating law school, and they're going to come out of school making a couple $100,000 a year. Well, if they got in a car accident, someone gets hurt, they can now actually be sued for their future income potential. And when I think about the cost of liability insurance, it's so inexpensive on a relative basis that we really want to make sure that we're planning appropriately for that. Let's talk a little bit more about long-term care. And this is one, I think there's a lot of misconceptions on long-term care side. But long-term care, we just did a series of podcasts on long-term care as well. But long-term care is really there to protect against catastrophic risk associated with the inability to perform 2 of the 6 daily activities, or you have cognitive impairment. And so there are insurance policies in place that you can use to cover the cost of that. From my perspective, the big risk there is making sure that we're integrating that risk within someone's long-term financial plan, because the real risk I see is you have a healthy surviving spouse that still wants to live life and they're still very active, but you have another spouse that is ailing and, of course, now has extensive medical bills associated with their care. That can deplete a portfolio extremely quickly. And so we can talk about long-term care, integrating that in, but I also just think we need to make sure that we talk about how that fits into your overall financial plan. If you have a long-term care policy, let's make sure we're reviewing it. Personally, I wouldn't look at even acquiring one until you're in your early to mid-50s, right? That's usually when we start looking at these outside of an employer-related plan, but it's definitely something that we want to make sure that we're adding on. Next up, let's talk about estate documents. What are the estate documents we need, and why do we need those, Austin?
Yeah. So the most typical estate documents that we need is a will, if you have one, trust documents, if you have, say, an irrevocable trust or revocable living trust, powers of attorney, and beneficiary designations.
I'm going to add one more, medical directives as well.
Right.
Yeah, which, and this is where, dependent upon where you are in life, those can change dramatically. The number one thing that I see is someone might have gone through and built this beautiful estate plan, but they don't retitle the assets into those accounts, or they don't update the beneficiaries appropriately as well. Like they're not administering to the intention of what those documents are. And when I think about the integration of why a financial advisor exists and some of the value that they provide, it's on this, right? Like there's no point spending a couple $1,000s on these documents and then not putting everything into the accounts the way that they're supposed to be put.
So they actually perform what they're supposed to do.
Bingo. And I think you had an example on a beneficiary designation, when we caught that. Yeah.
So beneficiary designations on retirement plans, IRAs, and Roths are extremely important. They override wills. The person that's listed is going to get the funds. And a real life example that really stuck out to me was we received, an IRA statement and beneficiaries from a prospective client. The IRA was $3 million and he was on his second, marriage. And the IRA was still titled to his ex-wife. When we pointed that out, his eyes were the size of saucers. I mean, he was pretty disturbing to him. And that's, I think, something that's really important is just making sure that you have the funds titled to go to the right people and not the wrong ones.
By the way, I've actually unfortunately seen that after the person had passed away as well. And then that creates a whole nightmare situation for the surviving spouse and children of the first marriage as well, right? So, the thing is estate plans are very, very important, very morbid. Most people don't like having those conversations because they are very morbid, but it's something that you need to be intentional about at the end of the day, because making sure that the assets are appropriately, not only in the account structures the way that they're supposed to be, but most importantly, that we're also setting up beneficiary designations. Because as you mentioned, beneficiary designations on retirement accounts trump whatever the will or the trust say. So we want to make sure that those are getting updated. And that's another great example of when you have multiple legacy retirement plans from previous employers, it's so easy to forget one, and it's so easy to not have those beneficiary designations updated. And it's a great reason why, we're big advocates for consolidate, whether it be consolidate with your current plan or consolidate with a traditional IRA outside of those and get everything in one place. Because if something happens to you, you want to make it as it's already an emotional period of time, but you want to make it as easy and administratively burden-free as possible, right? And having stuff all over the place is really difficult. Let's talk about debt, Austin, because this isn't one that I think also gets understated as well. What type of debt statements are we looking for? How do we integrate that, and why is that important?
Yeah, some of the things we're looking for is mortgage statements, any substantial credit card balance that isn't one that you just pay off monthly, auto loans, student loans, and I think the most important, the interest rate on each of those loans. Because one of the important things that we want to evaluate is cash flow, inflows and outflows, and properly allocating to be the most efficient. It doesn't necessarily make sense to pay down your 3% mortgage faster than schedule. If you have an 18% credit card with 10 grand, that's the first thing that has to go.
Man, I don't even know what an 18% card is anymore.
Yeah, that's a good rate.
Card rates are higher than that these days. Anyways, but you're absolutely right. And part of when we talk about cash flows, you got to inventory where the debt is, and then make prioritized decisions around that. Especially when you're younger, right? When you're younger, everything is chipping away at the same dollars. It can be hard, and that's typically where we see credit card accumulations happen, and they can bury you. And so this is where part of what we do, especially when we're working with younger households, when they're in that accumulation phase and they really need guidance, it's prioritizing, debt and how to manage debt. And some of it might even be looking at, for example, a home equity line of credit to reduce the interest rate associated with debt repayments and get that paid down as quickly as possible if you have equity in a home or something of that sort. But it's making sure that we're managing it in a very intentional way. Perfect segue to talk a little bit about budgeting and spending. This is one that I think I'm going through an exercise with my wife right now, because I don't want to say I'm the cobbler without shoes, but we're going through and we're actually coding. Amazon became this big black hole for us, right? Where it's just looking at, and Amazon's everything from kids to house to stuff, but where are we actually spending the money, right? And it's become a very time intensive exercise, but so revelationary on what is it we're spending, where we're spending, how we're spending, because it also gives us the ability to do some predictive analytics in the future. Like what do we see coming up? When do we need to budget for it? Talk to me a little bit about budgeting with regards to building out a financial plan if you're meeting with an advisor.
Yeah. So I think a lot of times retirement can be a relatively clean cut equation. It's a numerator over denominator. How much do you have versus how much do you spend? And undershooting expenses is very easy. When you're working and you're bringing in income, it's very easy to throw it on the credit card, pay the credit card off, throw it on the credit card, pay the credit card off. When you're in retirement, you don't have that income coming in. So if you think that you're spending about $100,000 and the reality is $200,000, that can be a huge problem. So it's important to really sit down and sort of break down your fixed and your variable expenses. What are these and what do we need in the future? I think one, it's good just as an exercise to understand where your money is going and how it could be better allocated. But also, I think it's useful for predictive purposes in the future.
Well, and I'll add to that, right? You're absolutely right. If we undershoot expenses, that could be devastating. But I also think that it can be catastrophically if we overshoot expenses and are not properly planning, especially in lower income years. I've seen a lot of clients where and I will add, you don't actually know what your retirement expenses are until you're actually in retirement. Like there's an element where, it's uncertain until you're actually living it. You don't really know. But once we have that, and that's why the first 18 to 24 months are so important when you're building out a retirement plan. First 18 to 24 months of someone's retirement are so important, because then we can actually see real data. But what happens is if we overinflated those expenses and model what that expense is going to be in the future, well, candidly, we could actually be missing out on opportunities now because we were overinflating and not being realistic about what the actual expenses are. So it goes both ways, underestimating and overestimating. And why I think that it's important. I know we're talking a lot about what to bring on your first meeting, but this is a great example, though, of why a financial plan can't just be done, put on a shelf, and never revisit it. It's an organic document that has to constantly be updated and addressed, because what we're really trying to do is anticipate what are your future needs are going to be, and how do we build out cash flow related strategies to meet and satisfy those future needs today. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the goals around budgeting, right? Because it's very common when we're sitting down. I like to paint the picture when we sit down with a household. It's not just basic operating of life now. In so many instances, people have things that are extremely important to them. It could be weddings, it could be vacation homes or boats. I think it's just really, really important as you're sitting down with a financial advisor to start thinking about the fun stuff as well. Like, what are the things that you'd like to see? And then we're going to help with building out the reality of that, right? Like, you have a kid that moves to another state. Well, you might now all of a sudden want to have a second home so that you can be closer to the grandchildren, right? Okay, let's build that into the financial plan. And I will tell you this, we're not yes men. If it doesn't work, we're going to tell you it doesn't work. And I think being intentional around that is important. Or simultaneously, we'll tell you the other way around. Yeah, it works, and we'll give you the peace of mind that you can absolutely move forward with something like that if it's something you want to pursue. And then we're going to help with building out the strategies associated with this is what we need to do in order to be able to make this work, right? Anything you want to add to that?
I was going to say, yeah, absolutely. The last thing that you should bring is sort of your goals and what you want to do in the future. Financial planning can sound like a bit of a dry process. We're grabbing all these numbers, we're, crunching the numbers. But I think it's important to also come with ideas of what you want retirement to be. What's the lifestyle that you want to have? What are your goals? just what do you want to do for your kids, legacy planning. I think financial planning is something that's very alive. It's something that, again, you're revisiting every year. And I think it can be fun and exciting. It's not all grabbing spreadsheets and old statements.
Bingo. No, and needs to be consistently reviewed. When you're younger, maybe the cadence doesn't need to be quite as often as once you've entered into retirement, where we're now in that deaccumulation mode and it needs to be done. But I will tell you, the earlier you can engage with a financial advisor, the better off you are. And I believe that to my root core, because time value of money is a very real thing. Dollar today is worth a lot more than a dollar in the future. And this is one of the reasons why I love when our clients have their children get engaged with us, because we know the value we can provide very, very early on. This doesn't need to be a scary or intimidating thing. Data matters, and we can create meaningful impact based upon that. Austin, this was a great conversation today. Thank you so much. If there's anything else you need from us, please don't hesitate to reach out.
The previous presentation by Bogart Wealth was intended for general information purposes only. No portion of the presentation serves as the receipt of or as a substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart Wealth or any other investment professional of your choosing. Different types of investments involve varying degrees of risk, and it should not be assumed that future performance of any specific investment or investment strategy or any other non-investment related or planning services, discussion, or content will be profitable, be suitable for your portfolio or individual situation, or prove successful. Neither Bogart Wealth's investment advisor registration status nor any amount of prior experience or success should be construed that a certain level of results or satisfaction will be achieved if Bogart Wealth is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advisory services. Bogart Wealth is neither a law firm nor accounting firm, and no portion of its services shall be construed as legal or accounting advice. No portion of the podcast content should be construed by a client or prospective client as a guarantee that he or she will experience a certain level of results if Bogart Wealth is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advisory services. Copies of Bogart Wealth's current written disclosure brochure and Form CRS discussing our advisory services and fees are available upon request or at www.bogartwealth.com.